Mr. Reddy, you are, well, officially you are an ombudsman, but I might allow to put the title ombudswoman on you, I hope.
You may, absolutely.
And you're dealing with perhaps the most interesting job in the European Union, because you are aware what is going on actually when it's not that good as it should be. Am I correct?
That is absolutely true, yes. I deal with what I call maladministration, poor administration within the EU institutions. So I'm like an ombudsman in Denmark and any of the member states. I get complaints from the public against the institutions, but in this case it has to be against the EU institutions. So the biggest institution complained against is the Commission, and not because the Commission is bad, but it's simply because it's big and it has the most interaction with people, with citizens, and therefore most of the complaints that we get would be against the Commission, but they can also be against any of the agencies of the EU, for example, the European Medicines Agency, or indeed the European Central Bank or the European Investment Bank. Parliament as well, but not the politics of Parliament, the administration of Parliament, the European Court, but the administration of the court and not the cases that they actually take.
Who can complain? Who can put a case in front of you? Could it, for instance, be people who are not feeling well due to the Charter of Fundamental Rights?
They can, yes, and in fact we do get complaints in relation to that. And what's interesting about the mandate that I work under is that you don't have to be personally affected by something to complain. So in relation to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, we might have, for example, an NGO, a charity working with migrants who feel that something has gone wrong perhaps with the EU's External Border Agency, otherwise known as Frontex. There's a problem there. They can complain to us on behalf of other people and say that the EU Commission or Frontex, whatever, is breaching fundamental rights. Most people who complain to us are EU citizens. We get journalists who might be making transparency, freedom of information requests, and they've been denied. We get NGOs. We also have businesses. Let's say there was a small business in Denmark, let's say, that had a contract with the Commission for a project or to provide a service. Let's say there was a problem with that. The Commission wasn't happy with what they were doing. Perhaps they want their money back. They come to us and we try and resolve the problem for them.
But can a common citizen complain to your office?
Yes, absolutely, and they do all the time. I mean, for example, let's say some young person was applying for a job in an EU institution. They did a competition run by what's known as EPSO, or the European Personnel Selection Office. Say they were unsuccessful, they feel that the process wasn't fair, they can apply to us to have their complaint dealt with. Businesses who have dealings with the EU institutions, they can complain as well. But it has to be against an EU institution. We get lots of complaints, thousands of complaints from citizens all over Europe, but many of their complaints are not admissible because they're actually about their own member state government, their own member state administration. But that's when we use the ombudsman from the member states. We send the complaints to them to see if they can help the citizen, or we send them somewhere else or advise them. We help everybody who comes to us to try and find the best place where they can have their problem resolved.
Now we are talking about people or NGOs or whoever approaching you. Can you approach a problem?
Yes, I can, and I have a very useful power in my statute, which is the power of own initiative, which means I don't actually have to get a complaint. If I think that there is something there that I could usefully deal with, then I can look into it. I mean, for example, one of the big investigations I did was into the trade negotiations that have been taking place between the EU and the United States, otherwise known as TTIP, or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. They're stalled at the moment while President Trump makes up his mind as to whether he wants to continue them or not. But we did a big investigation into how open those trade talks were, how transparent they were. And as a result of that, the European Commission started publishing a lot more documents about the trade talks. So that was something I did on my own initiative. Another interesting piece, which perhaps doesn't happen so much with member state ombudsmen, relates to conflicts of interest. We get a lot of complaints from NGOs, but also from ordinary citizens who might allege that, let's say, for example, there is an expert group advising the Commission about a certain matter. We might get an allegation that says that a member of the expert group is compromised, has a conflict of interest because they're working for a private interest, shall we say. We also deal with cases which are known here as revolving door cases, where an EU official might leave the civil service of the EU and go to work in the private sector.
Even a commission?
Exactly, yes. Commissioners as well might go and work in the private sector. There's nothing wrong with going and working in the private sector. But the public interest has to be protected. There's a public interest in making sure that the private interest doesn't profit from the perhaps sensitive and very important information that the official has in his or her head, or indeed that the commissioner has in his or her head when they go to the private sector. So that's something we look at quite closely.
Many times a problem or a way of finding the right way is put in front of a committee of experts. You mentioned yourself.
Yes.
To us journalists, it's almost impossible to find out either who they are, who have been electing these so-called experts, and what are their mandate.
Yes, and I think that that's a very good point that you make, and which is one of the reasons why we did one strategic investigation into expert groups. And we looked at a number of things. One of the things we looked at was balance in the groups, gender balance in the groups. We looked at the balances between civil society interests and industry interests. Now, it doesn't have to be 50-50, depends on the group. Yeah. We also looked at how the Commission checks for conflicts of interest in relation to this. And basically we gave the Commission a template for how it could make the expert groups a lot more transparent and also a lot more accountable to journalists like yourselves and the public generally.
You also mentioned transparency. Maybe that's one of the biggest issues you are, may I say, fighting. That you want transparency even into the Council, even into the Commission's work, correct?
Yeah, and particularly we're looking at the Council at the moment, because when people think about the EU, when they think about it, they tend to think about the Commission. The Commission they understand. The Council they don't. And the Council itself is confusing, because certainly in the English language you have the European Council, which is the heads of state. You have the Council, which is the ministers from all of our member states who go and meet and decide on legislation. And of course you have the Council of Europe, which has nothing got to do with the EU, which is a building right beside where we are here, right. But it's nothing got to do with the EU. So people get confused about that. And then they don't realise that it's the Council alongside the Parliament who are the co-legislators. They're the ones who make the laws. And, you know, famously in all of our member states, I suppose, when national politicians, when good things happen, it's our, you know, we did it. When bad things happen, it's Brussels. So what we're trying to do is to allow people to see that when they talk about Brussels, they're actually talking about their own member state ministers who form the Council, who legislate with the Parliament, not with the Commission. The Commission might propose the law, but it's only the Parliament and the Council who agree on it. So one of the pieces we're doing now is looking at the Council, you know, what is visible at Council level from, you know, initially when a proposal goes in and officials from the different member states work on it, then it goes up to the permanent representatives, the ambassadors to the EU, and then it goes up to the ministers. So we're looking to see what is transparent. And of course, politically, it's very interesting because the Council feels it can have an interest in not being transparent because they're trying to get 28 member states to agree on something, to form a consensus. So they don't want the disagreements to come out. But really, people have a right to see how legislation has been formed, what amendments are being made, what compromises are being made, indeed what their own member states are agreeing to or not agreeing to. And that's what we're trying to open up a bit, rather than have always the faceless Brussels bureaucrat blamed for everything, when it's actually very often their own member state ministers who are doing the particular work.
A part of this fighting towards transparency is the case of lobbyists. Thousands of lobbyists are approaching parliamentarians and commissioners in order to, well, gain something out of their visits and their contacts.
Yes.
It's said that they shall be registered. Is that possible?
It is. There is a thing called the Transparency Register, the Lobbying Register, which is a voluntary register up until now, but there's a big push to make it mandatory and to include not just the Commission and the Parliament, but also the Council, because obviously it's the ambassadors and the people who work for the Member States at Council level who are also lobbied. And Brussels, I think, after Washington, is the biggest lobbying capital in the world. Because what people don't realise is that when the EU regulates, whether it's regulating for digital economy, whether it's regulating for pharmaceuticals, whatever, it's regulating for the world. It can be a global regulator. So obviously what the Commission does and the regulations, or what the EU does in terms of its regulation, has an impact on the profits of big companies all over the world. So it's in their interest to come to Brussels and set up shop and try and lobby the institutions, which is perfectly valid, of course, because the institutions have to know the effect or the likely impact of the regulations on companies, on individuals, whatever. So that's fine. But it has to be transparent.
But on the other hand, they need the lobbyists.
They do, yes, of course.
Advised.
They need to be advised. But
and have a contact
absolutely,
to the
but it has to be done appropriately. People need to know who is influencing something. A piece of legislation is going through and suddenly it's kind of changing track and something's happening and amendments are dropping or new amendments are... How is that happening? And if you have transparency in relation to lobbying, then people can see, oh well, so-and-so is lobbying the Commission, so-and-so is lobbying the Parliament or the Council, and then at least people can know how the legislation is being influenced.
Behind us is the Court of Human Rights, belonging to the Council of Europe. It's almost dying in its own success. There are coming that many complaints from all over the 47 countries that they cannot cope with that amount of cases. Can you?
With the cases that come to
Yes.
me? Well, yes, compared to the Council of Europe, we get comparatively few. We are limited in what we do, obviously, because the complaints have to be against the institutions. And as I said, most of the complaints that we get are actually against the Member States. But yes, we do deal with them. We've had an increase, quite a high increase this year in the number of complaints that we're dealing with. But what I've tried to use my resources well, because we are a small office. I mean, we're 80 compared with 30,000 in the Commission.
How many?
30,000
how
in
many
the
are you?
80.
Okay.
In the Office of the Ombudsman. So that's why I've been putting a lot of emphasis on our systemic or strategic investigation. So instead of just doing this complaint and that complaint and that complaint, in one investigation we can solve a problem and then the complaints stop. For example, when we were looking at the TTIP, the trade negotiations, we were getting complaints, we were getting access to documents, requests that had been refused, and people were looking to us to review it. So by doing the investigation and encouraging the Commission successfully to publish more proactively, we stopped the complaints. We dealt with the complaints there. Equally with the expert groups, conflicts of interest, revolving doors. When we deal with the systemic issue, we can deal with a lot of complaints at the one time and also stop them happening again.
The normal procedure to get a case at the court I just mentioned is that it has been through all legal
the national remedies and all of
institutions
that,
in the national country. Do people have to have approached the national ombudsman before they get to you?
No, not at all. No, I'm not an appeals body from the National
Are you
Ombudsman.
cooperating with national?
Absolutely. I chair a network of the EU Ombudsman, also
a regular yearly meeting?
Yes, we have our own intranet. We share experiences. I would share complaints with the National Ombudsman. They would also come to me if they have an issue involving EU law. We meet once a year in Brussels and discuss matters of mutual interest. I've started doing parallel investigations so that they might do the Member State piece and I would do the EU piece. For example, one of the first ones we did involved returns flights. This is basically, let's say somebody has been denied asylum status in a country. They don't want to go back, but they're being forced back, forced returns. So Frontex, which is the external border agency, it would arrange a flight. It would say to the Member States, do you have people that you want to return to, let's say Nigeria, for example? You say yes, so Frontex collects the people from the different Member States, brings them back. So we were looking at this from the human rights perspective, from the Charter of Fundamental Rights perspective, and we did an investigation with the member state colleagues into how people's human rights are protected on the flights. Very practical things, how are women dealt with, how are families dealt with, how are people with medical problems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Or what restraints are used on flights. Because sometimes you can have restraints which are not proportionate to the issue. So I think about 19 of my colleagues who monitored the flights from their countries did their reports. I did my report, presented it to Frontex and the Commission, and they accepted a lot of the recommendations that we made. So that's one way in which we work collectively.
Getting closer to the end of this wonderful interview, are you cooperating with the Agency for Fundamental Rights in Vienna of the Union and by the committee at this Parliament dealing with the claims of the citizens?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, just yesterday here in Strasbourg, I had a meeting with the head of FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency, who's an Irish person like myself, Michael O'Flaherty, and we had a very good conversation and discussing how we can collaborate. I was asking him for information on certain issues that have come across my desk. Equally, he was inquiring into the work that we do, yes. Also, next week I'm going before the Libe Committee, which deals with civil liberties and some of the issues we've been dealing with, to talk to them about my work. So there's a lot of collaboration between all of us, which is very important.
From where, and that's my final question, do you get the strength and the motivations to keep on fighting the way you do?
Well, it's a very, very privileged position to be working in the EU, particularly at this time. I'm a former journalist myself. I was a political journalist in Ireland. Therefore, obviously, the politics of the EU fascinates me. The work that I do is very rewarding, particularly when you get a good result. So I consider myself very fortunate to have this position, and that's all the motivation that I need.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.